So I want to touch into a little bit what the history of jhana is for those of you that are unfamiliar, and as a reminder for those of you who are more familiar. The jhana practice preceded the Buddha. It was being practiced on earth prior to any writing system. So it was an oral tradition that was taught verbally for some period of time before writing was invented. The earliest writings we have of jhana practice come from the yogic tradition, particularly a piece of material called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. There are probably about 5 or 6 translations into English of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I've looked through all the ones, particularly when I was working on practicing the jhanas, which I later published with co-author. I looked through those, and some of the Yoga Sutra translations, I could see enough pieces that I could see what we practice reflected. It wasn't as elaborate and detailed as the Theravada Buddhist presentation, but there were enough of the markers and the way we work with it that I could see the connection. So the Buddha, when he left palace life, went off and became effectively a wandering spiritual seeker. I think they call them sadhus in India. Anyway, the point is he wandered for something like 6 years, meeting up with some others and practicing the spiritual practices of the day, which were predominantly yogic practices. The yogic tradition, as I understand it, was the primary tradition in that part of Asia during that history, that part of time. And then out of that evolved Hinduism and then later Buddhism. And the Buddha took a lot of the yogic practices and he organized them in a particular way, which was his contribution. And then he developed other practices that aren't in the yogic tradition that we do. So the way that I understand and present the jhana practice, it was practiced by the Buddha. It was something that he did throughout his life. So he learned it. They're not sure if he left palace life in his 20s or 30s, but somewhere in that range. And that's where he first began practicing the jhanas. He did, there are 8 jhanas potential. Actually, in my teaching, I talk about a 9th jhana, which we'll get to later. But traditionally, there's 8 jhanas presented, 4 form jhanas, which are jhanas that are experienced in the body, in our form. And then there are 4 formless jhanas that are not experienced in our body. The formless jhanas are also referred to as formless realms because the perception is that we journey, awareness and consciousness journey through the crown chakra and enter into this particular specific realm. Each of the formless jhanas, again, we'll go through all this later in this progression, is, in my view, a particular function, quality, or expression of the absolute. So we're steeping in this particular quality, and it does a purification of mind. All concentration meditation in Theravada Buddhism is considered purification of mind practices. Purification of mind means that it not only helps soften our allegiance to the sense of self, but it softens our concepts and definitions of the world. So we get to be more permeable, softer, more open. We lead with more curiosity. We orient more to ultimate truth of the absolute, rather than conditioned truth of the world. So these practices were practiced during the Buddha's lifetime. The Theravada monastics, some of them now will live in forests and out in the woods. And in Southeast Asia, they have the monsoon season, which I believe is in the fall for maybe 2 or 3 months, 3 months, I believe. And the monastics will go to a brick and mortar, um, monastery, or I call monastery nunneries. I just call them all monasteries. So I'm not favoring the men. I'm including monastics, whatever gender, as monastics. But they go and they're housed in temples somewhere. And a lot of the Theravadan monastics will develop jhana practice during that period. The Buddha was reported to have done jhana practice not only before becoming awakened, but also he maintained it as a regular practice, a practice he did during what they call the rains retreat, or vasa is how they pronounce it in Burma. And in fact, the jhana practice was the very last practice he did before he died. He did the jhanas 1 through 8, then he went from 8 down to 1, came out of jhana and passed away. So it was significant enough practice to him that it was the very last practice he did. So that was very impressive to me when I first learned about this practice. But the Buddha learned these practices, again, prior to his significant awakening, and he was invited to teach at that time, but he could see that the benefit of the jhana practice and concentration meditation is predominantly when we're doing the practice. When our concentration, our meditative concentration wanes, softens down, is less collected, unified, then we're not able to access some of these qualities or states. They're dependent upon the meditation. So the Buddha could see that these are great. They're slices of the absolute. They're pieces, tastes of freedom, but it's not permanent. It's not lasting. And that's really where he began focusing on the development of the vipassana practices, which are, in effect, a lot of practices that relate to purification of view, how we view things, both our conceptual positioning and also how we connect and relate to the objects that we observe and connect with. So this became an important part of Buddhism, particularly Theravada Buddhism. If you showed up at my teacher's monastery in Myanmar today and wanted to practice there for a period of time, this is the practice you'd be given. Only if someone does a very earnest, sustained attempt to engage and develop this practice, only if they did that and were unable to get much development, might they be considered to be directed to do another practice. Otherwise, people would be left here doing this practice. So it's that important. After the Buddha died, this continued as a major practice in Theravada Buddhism. In Theravada Buddhism, it really is focusing on not changing the Buddha's teaching, presenting it precisely as he did it. My teacher, when he authorized me to teach, our agreement was that I would maintain presenting the practices as I learned them precisely, which I'm doing. That's what you're practicing. But he encouraged me to build bridges, to find language, relationship that was more accessible to Westerners. So a lot of the language I use around the practice is different than my teacher or the other teachers would present. But this was his encouragement, which really lets it become more landed in whatever culture it's traveling to or journeying to. So the practice came from India, Nepal area. At one point, it was brought into China. My understanding is that Buddhism first arrived in China through the writings of the Buddha, through the teachings of the Buddha, and it principally was undertaken or engaged with the philosophers, the scholars of the day. So they were intellectually analyzing Buddhism, looking at all the practices and understanding it in that way. It was only later that practitioners began making the journey, and the journey was so difficult in those days. It would sometimes take years to get from one place to another. I think the traveling was hard, the winters were brutal, and it was challenging. So when the practices made their way into China, In my view, and this is just not my opinion. There are other teachers that agree with me on this, or I agree with them, that the teachers in China or the Indian teachers in China really wanted to reduce the instructions as much as possible, because this is a practice where people can strive a lot. They know there's transcendent experiences that are a potential, meaning jhana, and people want it. That's a wholesome desire, nothing wrong with that. But it can create a lot of striving. It can get grabbed by the personality, and then the personality wants to do it. I want to get it. I want this achievement. I want the badge. I want the recognition. And so the teachers began reducing the language in the presentation, not talking as much about the results of the practice, really trying to just keep the bare bones of the practice of pay attention to the breath in this area. And they tried to put down or not mention any of the other practices or teachings along this area of practice. And I understand their motivation in it. But the problem is it got to where the teachers themselves were not able to maintain the practice, and new teachers didn't know all the steps that the Theravadan teachers knew. And the practice evolved, merging and incorporating the indigenous Chinese religions of Confucianism and Taoism into Buddhist practice, into Theravadan practice. And that ended up being the creation of what they called Jhana, which was how they pronounced jhana. And then that was shortened to Chan, and that was pronounced Zen in Japan. So the Theravadan jhana practice ended up morphing into what became the Zen practice of today, particularly the practice in Zen called shikantaza. And shikantaza, as I learned it about 50 years ago, we were given extensive instruction on the body, on posture, and we were told nothing about the interior experience. So I've told it before when I've taught shikantaza, I asked a lot of the senior practitioners, what are you doing when you're doing this practice? And I got as many answers as people I asked. So I realized that they don't actually know. Everyone's just winging it once they get the practice going. So a lot of the instructions got lost along the way. So part of what I think is happening now is we're bringing this practice back in a very particular way. We're filling in a lot of the missing information so that we can practice with this. And part of it is, in my view, is that I believe that the current body of spiritual practitioners have enough personal maturity. They can do practices, they can engage in practices that have benefits, that have transcendent experience potential, without being overly obsessed with getting it, without being disappointed if it doesn't happen, understanding it's a process. And in the process of this meditation, your mind, your sense of self is going to experience purification. So it is working whenever you do the practice, whether jhana ends up happening or not. So just know that purification of mind is a benefit and happening in this practice. Let me pause there. I've said a lot. Let me see if there's any questions.